Hey Lit lovers, Happy New Year and welcome to the second season of Getting Lit, a monthly podcast dedicated to highlighting the diverse lit coming out for the month. I am your host, Lala, and you can find me on Instagram at ThisBlackGirlReads. And welcome to the second season of Getting Lit. I have so many amazing, great things planned for you guys, discussions, book clubs as usual, and of course, a lot of great interviews coming up in 2022, so I can't wait to get started. And first, I want to thank everyone who has listened, everyone who has left a review, anyone who has shared positive words, positive vibrations, or who has shared the podcast with someone else. I appreciate it so much. So today we're going to be talking about all the books coming out in January that you should add to your list. And I'll be talking with Tochi Onyebuchi about his new book, Goliath, and of course, all things lit. So stay tuned for that near the middle of the episode. But first, let's talk about the books coming out this month. There are so many. I had to round them down based on the ones that I really wanted to read. I started to read a couple and I was like, nah, I'm not feeling this. So the ones that I finished, the ones that I read, the ones that I want to pass on, those are the books that I talk about in this episode, not the ones that kind of didn't make the cut. We don't talk about those ones. So again, I am Lala. Find me on Instagram at ThisBlackGirlReads. And on today's show, we'll discuss a book about Brooklyn and Puerto Rican independence, a new essay collection from the original GOAT, Zora Neale Hurston. We have two books based on Nigerian culture and a manifesto from a Booker Prize winning author. So, are you ready to get lit? Okay, so the first book that we are talking about today is Olga Dies Dreaming by Xochitl Gonzalez, and it comes out on January 4th. So I absolutely love this debut novel. I was so drawn to it from the first chapter, and the book follows two siblings, Olga Acevedo and her brother Pietro. And Olga is like a high-priced, sought-after wedding planner who is single and she's trying to figure it out. But despite all of her career success, she's still not happy. So meanwhile, her brother Pedro is a U.S. representative from Brooklyn and he kind of works in the community. He's definitely trying to make the best of his community and trying to help people like himself. So they were both born in Brooklyn, and they were the offspring of two radical Puerto Rican revolutionaries who followed the footsteps of Pedro Campos. And their father dies, well, not very young, when they're teenagers, of AIDS, picked up through drug use. And their mom deserts them when Olga is 13 and her brother is 17. So Pedro changes his plans for college to stay home and kind of help his grandmother take care of Olga. And through the years, the two kind of receive letters from their mom, who is in this underground kind of radical movement. And they never know kind of what she's doing. They never know where she is, but she's always sending them these messages that they need to join the movement, that they need to do what they can do to help get this Puerto Rican independence. So she also talks about how she's disappointed in the lives that they've established for themselves. And through that, they're kind of torn between longing, anger, disappointment, betrayal, and uncertainties of their lives and kind of making their mom proud and all of that. So the question that is kind of the center of the story is Olga and Pietro kind of want to determine what it means to be Puerto Rican and how much their identity is based on this Brooklyn neighborhood that they live in. So I truly love this story. When I first started reading it, I really thought that it was going to be very chill and rom-com-ish, but it ended up being something totally different than what I thought. But it was a really good read. I learned so much about Brooklyn. I learned so much about Puerto Rican and Puerto Rican independence and some of the struggles that community faced. So this is such a great read. It comes out on January 4th. This one is called Olga Dies Dreaming by Xochitl Gonzalez. So the next book On our list for today is You Don't Know Us Negroes and Other Essays by the GOAT, Zora Neale Hurston. And this one comes out on January 18th. So, You Don't Know Us Negroes and Other Essays is a collection of Zora Neale Hurston's nonfiction work. So, the introduction is written by one of my favorite people, Henry Louis Gates Jr., and by Genevieve West. And it's a kind of overview of Hurston's place in the literary and cultural worlds, both during her lifestyle and more recently. So the collection spans more than 3 decades and is penned during the backdrop of the birth of the Harlem Renaissance, the Montgomery bus boycott, desegregation of the military, and school integration. And Hurston's writing, as it does always, articulates the beauty and authenticity of Black life the only way that she could do it. Although she's best known for her novels like Their Eyes Were Watching God and Dust Tracks on the Road, she was also a very premier essayist. So You Don't Know Us Negroes is the first actual comprehensive collection of her nonfiction work, and it spans about 35 years of essays, of criticism, and articles, and more. So this one is called You Don't Know Us Negroes and Other Essays by Zora Neale Hurston, and it comes out on January 18th. Next on our list, we got Wahala by Nikki May, and it comes out on January 11th. So this book was so hard to put down once I started reading it. So in essence, this is a story following a friend group made up of 3 British Nigerian girls who all met when they were young in grade school and bonded over kind of their shared heritage. So we have Ronke, Simi, and Boo, who grew up together and are really close friends, like close like sisters. They share everything. They share their successes, they share their dreams, and they also share their failures until something happens. So with the introduction of Isobel, a childhood friend of Simi, things start to take a turn, and the 3 close friends kind of start to question their friendship. Like something happens that will tear them apart. I don't want to give away too much, but I still want to let you guys know about this book. So Ronke, Simi, and Boo are 3 Anglo-Nigerian friends living in London. Ronke, she's a dentist. She has a stalker and a boyfriend who won't commit. Simi works in fashion alongside people who think calling her urban is a compliment, and she's married to Martin, who wants to start a family as soon as possible, despite the fact that he is currently being based in New York. And then we have Boo, who feels increasingly more trapped at home with her husband and the demands of having a toddler, Sophia, at home. So when Simi's glamorous and recently divorced friend Isobel joins the group, Ronke and Boo are immediately put out by her self-confidence, her attitude, and her, she's extravagant and she displays all of her wealth. Soon Isabel and the woman become friends, but simultaneously their lives all begin to unravel in ways none could have seen coming. This book is full of Nigerian color, which made it so tasty and flavorsome to read. The food, the culture, the dialogue, and the references to Lagos all form a spectacular backdrop to the engrossing plot. We know from the opening lines that the story is very shocking, and there's a shocking event that leaves us wondering throughout the entire story, who is this shocking event about? So that was really intriguing to me as well. So this one is called Wahala by Nikki May, and it comes out on January 11th. Next book on our list today is Manifesto on Never Giving Up by Bernardine Evaristo. And this one comes out on January 18th. So this book, I don't even know where to start. I don't know where to begin, but this one was just such an absolute joy to read. I got through it so quickly, so easily. So in Manifesto, Bernardine Evaristo presents us with a kind of retrospective of her life from her childhood, specifically growing up in a mixed race family in London during the 60s and 70s. She talks about her love life, years as a theater student and her lifelong journey as a writer, all the way up to when she wins the 2019 Booker Prize for her book Girl, Woman, Other, making her the first Black British person and the first Black woman to do so. So her candid, often humorous voice grabbed me from the very beginning. I found myself like speeding through Manifesto. What I loved most about this book is that it is a biography by a award-winning writer, and we hear her story, we hear how she developed as a writer, but it also serves kind of as encouragement to other writers, urging them to never give up and urging them forward. So I really like the balance that created, and I really enjoyed like the tidbits and the tips and the stuff that she gave from her own experience. So this one is called Manifesto on Never Giving Up, and it comes out on January 18th. So the final book on our list today is Yenka, Where Is Your Husband? By Lizzie Damilola Blackburn, and it comes out on January 18th. So to many, Yenka would be kind of a role model. She graduated from Oxford and she has worked her way up the ladder to a senior position at one of the best banks in the UK. She is by all means a successful woman in her 30s. To Yenka and many of her aunties, she is not married, and thus far, she's considered a failure. So this is a very funny and wonderful tale of friendship, of love, lost love, and rebuilding your confidence against the backdrop of Nigerian culture. Yenka is fed up with being compared to her younger sister Kemi, who is married and is expecting a baby. So fed up that her mom and aunties embarrass her at every gathering, and she feels compelled to either avoid them or to lie about her dating status. When her career takes a turn Yenka did not expect, she seems to kind of lose her identity, and then her ex-boyfriend turns up at a friend's engagement party with a stunning new fiance, and Yenka is driven to extreme dating measures. She sets herself up for the task to find her +1 for her friend's wedding, and along the way there are various mishaps that made me both laugh and cringe. So this is definitely a feel-good story. I feel like a lot of people have compared it to Bridget Jones's Diary, and it does have that kind of feel. Obviously the cultural aspects are very different, which I appreciated, but it's definitely a feel-good story. I loved all the Nigerian cultures and aspects. It's very light and it's a very worthy and substantial read. So this one is called Yenka, Where Is Your Husband? By Lizzie Damilola Blackburn, and it comes out on January 18th. Okay, book lovers, those are all the books that I'm highlighting today on the show. Thank you so much for listening, and hopefully you can add one of these books to your list. Now let's get into my conversation that I had with the award-winning author Tochi Onyebuchi, and we talk about all things lit and, of course, his new book coming out this month, Goliath. So here's our conversation. I'm so excited to be kicking off 2022 with a special guest. Today, I will be getting lit with none other than Tochi Onyebuchi and talking about all the things Goliath, his new book coming out at the end of the month. So without any further ado, Tochi, welcome to Getting Lit. I really hope I didn't butcher your last name, did I?
Oh, no, you're fine. No, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So your writing career has been so vast. This is going to be your 7th book. I know that my son loves the Marvel comic book series that you did. So tell me a little bit how you got started in writing.
So it's actually my mom's fault. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a comic book artist. I loved to draw. And we would have these 3-ring binders that were just full of blank sheets of paper. There'd be like 500 sheets of paper in them. And I would fill them up with sketches, completely fill them up over the course of maybe, 10 days, 2 weeks. And so one day, I might have been in 3rd, maybe 4th grade at the time. Mom saw me one day and she said, Tochi, you have all these characters. Why don't you write stories about them? And at the time, I was like, Mom, why are you giving me homework? But But then I started doing it, to each blank sheet of paper, I would attach a, notebook page, and I would write a little one paragraph summary of their adventures. And then one paragraph became two, became three, and then they started meeting each other. And I was like, oh, this is pretty interesting.
Mommy's onto something.
Yeah. And then in 7th grade, I took my very first creative writing class. So this was the very first time that storytelling was part of this curriculum. And it was really just part of our English class. And in Nigerian households, grades are, your life currency. They're what determine your worth and your place at the table for dinner. So I realized very quickly that in this creative writing class, I could, I would get an A, easily on every single assignment. And so you had that feedback loop. This was a thing that I enjoyed doing, and I was getting all this incredible external validation from it. I was off to the races. And then by high school, I was writing whole novels. I was
in high school? Wow. That's amazing.
I'm not very good with moderation as far as my writing career is concerned.
I heard somewhere that you wrote an astounding 17 manuscripts before you got your first book published. Is that true?
Yes, that is true.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
It is. I mean, it's telling, too, because in any line of work, if you're putting in that much effort and you're producing that much product, and for a decade and a half, people are telling you no, that's pretty much God emphatically telling you to pursue a different line of work, right? Like, this ain't it, Chief. But I just loved writing so much that it never occurred to me that I wouldn't write. I loved writing more than I loved getting published. And that's one of the reasons why, I was able to do 17 different manuscripts. I just really enjoyed what I was doing. But yeah, no, that's a lot.
It was a lot, but it actually paid off. So
exactly.
So I'm always curious about what people are reading. So what are you reading now, and what did you just finish reading?
Oh my goodness, what am I reading now? Well, so there's a current work thing that I'm involved in that I can't really talk too much about, so that's gobbling a bunch of my reading time at the moment. But one of the things that I make sure is always part of my diet is magazines and periodicals. I love just learning about new things, and so, I read Wired magazine, Vanity Fair. I'm also, my favorite publication, and this is super nerdy and super wonky, is the London Review of Books. It's so random and weird and wonky and just jargony, but I love that stuff. And what's funny about it is, ostensibly the essays will be book reviews, right? It'll be a book review of the latest book from Viet Thanh Nguyen, for instance, or the latest book from Marlon James or something. But it'll unspool into this whole incredible, super scopic essay about all the issues sort of attendant to the ones that come up in the book.
Yes.
And so, it'll start out as I actually just last night read this incredible essay by Julian Barnes on Flaubert and his whole sort of personal history with not just Madame Bovary, but, l'éducation sentimentale and all the rest of his oeuvre and everything. And it was super meaningful, but it's nerdiest thing ever. It's literally the nerdiest thing ever. I geeked out over 4,000 words of this British writer talking about his personal relationship with this long dead French writer. And I'm just like, yes, put that right in my
give
veins.
me more.
Yeah.
That's so funny. So over the past little bit, I've been getting more into fantasy and science fiction, especially during quarantine. I think just to have that escape, I guess. And so of course I began with N.K. Jemisin, Octavia Butler. So what are some of the authors who have inspired you and books that have inspired you?
Oh man, N.K. Jemisin especially. The Broken Earth trilogy is just so monumental and game changing. It's going to be a very long time, I think, before we have anything even approaching a full picture of the influence that trilogy has had and will have on the genre. I will say one of my contemporaries, actually, who I draw a lot of inspiration from, is R.F. Kuang, who did the Poppy War trilogy. And I love those books so much. And it's interesting because, we talk about science fiction and fantasy as a vehicle for escape, right? Particularly during these rather dark and somewhat gruesome times that we're living in. But a lot of the fantasy and science fiction that I find myself drawn to isn't like super light reading.
Yes.
It's very like emotionally devastating stuff about like war and oppression and, you know, the ways in which not just technology manipulates us, but we manipulate technology for sort of nefarious ends and all these things. And so it's not as though I'm escaping into, you know, a world of rainbows and pink clouds, but I do think that what speculative fiction affords us is a certain amount of distance, right? Because there is, you know, in the context of a story, generally with the beginning, middle, and end, there's a certain organization to it, and that can give the reader a certain sense of control. We know that as dark as things get, there's going to be an end to this story, presumably. But also, you know, we get that same sort of comfort that we get in dealing with, or whenever we come across, you know, allegory. That's like, it's not the world that we're living in, but it can help us describe the world that we're living in. And I do think that, you know, when we talk about escape, we're also talking about that.
Absolutely. So one of the first books that I read of yours was Riot Baby and then War Girls. And it still kind of baffles me, the worlds that you're able to create. So how do you go about creating this world that doesn't exist?
Oh, I mean, I love that. That's like one of my favorite parts of the job. I mean, for me, I'm very image driven. So there'll be an image that pops in my head that is really cool and interesting. Say, for instance, the opening image of War Girls, which is Onyi basically tinkering with her metal arm on this workbench and then putting it on. That's a really cool image. When it first occurred to me, I didn't have any backstory to it. I didn't know where it was situated. I didn't know particularly who this girl is. And so much of writing is figuring out my way to that image. You know, with Beast Made of Night, my very first novel, it started out with this image of this little boy facing off against this giant shadow monster. And I didn't know anything else about the story, but so much of the writing was me trying to figure out what that image was, you know, working my way to that image. And so with the world building, there'll be a lot of really cool ideas and whatnot that are somewhat disconnected that are just really cool to me. And so in the beginning, it's all about collecting as many of these cool ideas as I can. And then the real work of world building is trying to make it all as cohesive as possible. How can I make it so that all these disparate elements fit within the same sort of story world? And that's a lot of fun. That's a lot of fun.
It sounds like a lot of fun. I think that there is definitely something so beautiful about Black imagination and guiding young adults to alter their thinking. So what made you want to write Black science fiction?
Oh, man, I don't even know. I know there was, back in 2013, I wrote this story called Still Life with a broom, a hammer, and a brick stacker. And ostensibly, at the time, I was working on this short story collection about all these people in this space colony. In my mind, it was going to be very sort of literary minded, sort of like a Mad Men in space type of thing. And I realized very quickly that at least the human characters, and even a lot of the non-human characters on this space colony were white, just by default. And I asked myself, okay, like, where are all the Black people? And I didn't necessarily assume that I had just written them out of the story because of whatever biases and prejudices I'd brought to, you know, the stories that I was writing. I figured, oh no, something must have happened to them. They must be back on Earth. And so I wrote the short story that ended up being the seed for Goliath. And I knew when I wrote that story that I had leveled up. It was the very first time that I'd written a story with Black people as main characters. And that was well in my 20s when this happened. And, like, I was in law school by the time this happened. Like, this was maybe like 8 years ago. This wasn't even that long ago. And I knew that this story that I different level from anything else that I'd written before. It was good. And so I think that opened the door in a way. And that made it easier when I wrote Beast Made of Night to have a protagonist that was Black and to situate him in this West African mythos and this whole sort of environment. And then things just sort of spun out from there. And for me, it's not necessarily about having a character's Blackness be incidental, but having it be a cornerstone of the story. And that isn't to say necessarily that their blackness is the fulcrum on which the story turns, although you could argue that that is the case with Riot Baby.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that, it wouldn't make sense to have anything other than a black protagonist in War Girls.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I couldn't write War Girls and not have Nigerian girls
Yes.
as protagonists,
Yes.
right? Like, I couldn't write Riot Baby and have non-black characters play Ella and Kev. I just couldn't do it.
It wouldn't make sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of where my thinking is in that respect. I want it to be the case that there's no other way that this story could be told other than with black main characters.
Okay, that's so interesting to me. So I'm in Canada, and when it comes to kind of publishing, I know that here and probably in the US, the industry is still pretty like white. How have you been able to navigate that in order to tell Black stories with these Black characters?
I've been incredibly fortunate in my journey, and I recognize too that it's very much a unicorn experience.
Yes.
And very much not the norm. I owe pretty much my entire writing career to women of color.
Mm-hmm.
The editor who bought Beast Made of Night and Crown of Thunder was Tiffany Lau, Taiwanese American. The editor who bought Riot Baby, my adult debut, Roshi Chen, Chinese American. Those two things basically blew the doors open. Those women gave me the opportunity. They opened the door and I was able to sort of kick it down. And I was able to show out. I was able to really do my thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, that isn't to say that I wouldn't have written dope books with white editors,
Mm-hmm.
but they wouldn't have been the books that I ended up writing were those editors white. And so I've been very, very, very fortunate in that my career has been an object lesson in the incredible stuff that can happen when people of color exist in multiple roles in the writing and publishing process. So I've been very fortunate. I've been very, very, very fortunate. And someday this situation can be somewhat closer to the norm than it already is.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That's good to hear. So before we get into your new book, I have to mention Black Boy Joy. I read all the stories, including yours, with my son, and there's something about that collection that really touches on the essence of Black boyhood. And it's beautiful because my son continues to go back to certain stories and reread them over and over again. So why do you think this collection was so necessary for this particular time?
I mean, has there been anything quite like it out there? I think that's the question that we need to ask. And, you look at a book like that and it makes absolute sense that, like, there's an audience for this and that this would do well and what have you. But then you think about, why hasn't something like this existed quite in the same way? And what's dope about it is, so many of the authors in the collection, we're friends,
Mm-hmm.
like we're homies, like,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think when there's that camaraderie, it really sort of comes through in the stories and the way that they're put together. I want to say too that writing the story was very much a healing exercise for me because it was happening in the midst of this pandemic that we're still in the middle of. And so there's a lot of darkness around and there's a lot of suffering, particularly in communities of color, particularly in Black communities that,
Mm-hmm.
in many ways over-affected by the horrors of the pandemic. And to write this story about this kid who loves skateboarding, which was essentially like me as a kid, it was so wonderful. It was so spiritually rejuvenating. And I'm so grateful to Kwame for giving me the opportunity to do that sort of thing because it was therapy for me.
Yeah.
It just goes to show there's an appetite for those sorts of stories. And it's also to say, even if there wasn't an appetite for those stories, they deserve to be out there.
They do.
They really do deserve to be out there because particularly for stories targeted at young readers, I think there needs to be the space for stories that aren't just about the suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or how difficult it is to be Black in the United States or in North America. Our identity is more than just suffering. And I think it's so important that depictions of that get out there.
Yeah, I totally agree. So let's talk about Goliath. In this book, we see the lives of those left behind on Earth when the wealthy have colonized space. The Earth is now kind of a remnant of what it once was. So you already mentioned that you got the idea of Goliath from this short story that you wrote. Can you speak a little bit more on that and how the idea kind of rejuvenated in your mind?
Certainly. The story came to me, the characters came to me. I wrote the story and then I tried to sell it. And, with no luck for a number of years, it just kind of sat on the hard drive. But I knew I wanted to return to it in part because of what I felt while writing it, which is that I had endured sort of skill jump. This thing was better, and I needed to figure out how and why it was better than so much else that I had written or was writing at the time. And I knew that there was more of the world of the story to explore.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd say probably tail end of 2014, I start writing other scenes, featuring some of the characters in the book. And it's very sort of out of order. I'm just kind of feeling my way around. I've never written a book like this.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, when I write a book, it's very ordered. I have an outline that came out of a synopsis. I know what's going to happen. But here, I was just, it was very much sort of as the spirit moved me in many ways. And I got to feel my way into the world through these characters. And then all of a sudden, I was like, wait, I have more material than can fit in a short story.
Yeah.
Let's see what we can do with this here. And then it just sort of, built out from there. And in the spring of 2015, I finished the first draft of Goliath. And it was so dope. It was so dope. I was like, this is it. This is going to be the book that gets me published. I was convinced, but it didn't quite work out that way. I was getting very encouraging rejection letters, but they were still rejection letters. Yeah. And so, sat on it and then, did law school, had a, career as a legal professional, as a lawyer. And then, I got into YA. And throughout the course of my career, I kept looking back over my shoulder at Goliath. And I knew something was going to happen with it. It was the book that I ended up showing my agent when, I first signed with him. And he was like, this is really dope. Let's see what we can do with this. But I didn't quite know how to get it to where I wanted it to go, if that makes sense. And that sounds very sort of amorphous, but, I'd been reading a ton in the interim and coming across all sorts of books that I wanted to sort of use as models, lodestones of inspiration for what I wanted Goliath to mean. Books like The Lives of Others by Neil Mukherjee or A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James.
I love that book.
It's like my second favorite book of all time.
Oh, really? I love that book.
It's my favorite book by a living author. It's, oh, man. I think because I'm Jamaican
and I'm obsessed with Bob Marley and that entire thing. So when that book came out, I was just like, oh my gosh, I have to read it. Because I was already obsessed with that, right? So that book is so well done. Yeah.
And so I was like, I want Goliath to be a book that can evoke in another reader the feelings that these books evoked in me. I just don't know if I'm a good enough writer to get it to that place. And so work was like, okay, how can I build my own confidence and how can I build my own skill set to bring Goliath to where I wanted it to be? And so much of the writing of the book, up until I sold it and, during the editing process subsequent, was me writing at the very edge of my skills, which was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Everything that I've written generally, I've known how to write. Like I was sure that I could pull off. Even Riot Baby. I knew when it was mission accomplished. Yeah. With Goliath, I was constantly wondering if I had reached or would ever reach mission accomplished. And it was really cool, but also, again, really terrifying. And so it just sort of, it grew, and now it's very much a book that I'm immensely proud of and that I hope can really do for other readers what some of those books that I mentioned beforehand had done for me.
That's awesome. I don't know, I'm going to put you on the spot, but I was wondering if you could read an excerpt for us from Goliath?
Oh, yes. So this is a scene in the fall section of the book, which is part 2. The book is divided into 4 parts. And this scene concerns 2 stackers, Tamika and Sydney. In Mercedes' car, Tamika and Sydney ambled out of New Haven, west by southwest, tracing the old Metro North line. The farther they got from the city, the slower Tamika drove. And maybe Wyatt would have been proud, because other people would have thought she was just moving this way to take in the scenery. Like she had never seen back roads so overgrown with vegetation that they turned into corridors filled with red admirals and the occasional peacock. They would have thought she was listening to the bird song and maybe admiring how the departure or death of the people who'd lived here had turned this place into the Garden of Eden again. But really what she was listening for, was threats. The gangs and marauders filled open road and interstate highway well enough, but the truly fucked up found shelter in the forest. Sydney was silent next to Tamika, and Tamika hoped that Sydney was thinking this as well. There was no smile on the quiet girl's face, no wonder radiating from her eyes. Maybe she'd seen stuff like this before. Maybe she didn't care. But their GPS was outdated. Heading into Bridgeport, they were supposed to have passed through at least 4 radiation checkpoints, even if the surveillance drones overhead told the guards in the QZ that you'd stayed along mandated routes. But every station was the same. Abandoned cars stripped for parts, dragonflies and mosquitoes hovering over ponds of stagnant water, a dog lazily baking in the shade of a massive leaf. Milford and Stratford weren't towns so much as they were 2 conjoined forests with towns falling apart inside them. And Tamika remembered that time she and Wyatt had stayed in an abandoned house on their way to New Haven that had felt much the same. It wasn't huge, but it told them the apartment they'd grown up in had been too small for their family. And boars rampaging through the forest had given them plenty of meat for their meals. But then a wolf pack had cornered her in the house while Wyatt had been out scouting roots out east. And Tamika had had to use up all their bullets, shooting each one of them dead. When she found out later that Wyatt had taken the wolf meat with them for them to eat along the way instead of helping her bury the animals, she refused to speak to him for a week. In Bridgeport, the roads didn't really open up, but Sydney sat at attention in her seat, and that was when Tamika noticed that families had started to dot the landscape. An older man in a sleeveless shirt, nursing a lemonade under a mulberry tree. Kids in a cleared patch of land doing yard work, so much yard work that their denim overalls had turned a faded brown, corn cobs drying on a line, an outside basin with a cistern filled from a well, and none of them coughing blood into their hands. Sydney turned her neck to watch each of them as they came into view and faded into the distance. Maybe that was the thing with her, Tamika reasoned. Maybe she's just gone too long without seeing people. She ain't seemed feral, and she ain't seemed particularly lonely. But she hadn't hesitated when Tamika had offered to take her on a supplies run to Fairfield. The maglev car eased off a back road onto the remains of a highway, and the rundown Metro North tracks were beside them again. The towers of the Fairfield QZ loomed ahead, and against the sky was a blue dome, heralding their arrival at a safe haven. The line of cars wasn't nearly as long as Tamika expected. "Something's wrong," Sydney said. The first words she'd spoken the whole trip. Before Tamika could so much as agree, Sydney was out of the car. Tamika fumbled through the glove compartment for their masks, rustling through the vouchers she'd picked up from everyone before setting off for here, then was out of the car and hurrying to Sydney's side. "Here," she said, handing Sydney the worn filtration mask and watching her to make sure she put it on properly. She didn't look like the type of person who took care of herself, or who cared to. Before they got too far from the car, Tamika touched the small of her back to make sure she'd remembered to bring her and Wyatt's pistol with her. Inside each of the cars Tamika walked past was emptiness. They went forward at a slow enough pace that Tamika could stop at each one in the line up to the wall of the quarantine zone and cup her hands around her face as she looked through the dusty window. No skeletons, so at least it looked like people had left in time. No supplies either.
So good. At this point, I'm sure that all my audience will clap. So good. So some of the images and the themes are just so vivid. Who was your favorite character to write in this book? And which character do you like identify with the most?
Whew. I have to say maybe my favorite character to write was Sydney. And I think part of it was that her backstory, which is revealed over the course of the book, took me to places that the other characters didn't necessarily take me. And I mean that geographically, but I also mean that emotionally. One thing that I wanted to do with Goliath that I wasn't necessarily able to do with Riot Baby for issues of page count and constriction and theme was explore a wider range of emotional experience with my characters. This is a much funnier book than Riot Baby, and there's a lot more humor in it, and there's a lot more joy in it, even though that may not necessarily be the most pervasive register. Mm-hmm. And Sydney gave me scenes where I got to explore a lot of that. I have to say, maybe the character with whom I identify the most would be Link, who's, he sort of gives us the spine of the book, the vertebrae of the book in many ways. And one of the reasons why I feel such strong identification with him is that he's very much unknowable to himself. He can come across from time to time as a sort of cipher, as somebody that things happen to. And, he's not necessarily the most expressive character, but you can tell that he's trying to figure himself out and keeps running into this wall. And I've seen that in so many different instances, particularly with regards to Black manhood, mm-hmm. where, we're these incredibly complex emotional beings capable of such variegated emotional and psychological states. But sometimes you ask us to articulate that and we can't, and then that turns into a frustration that ends up getting acted out in various different ways. Mm. And I think that's such a fascinating psychological dynamic, and Link gave me opportunities to really sort of explore that and play that out. And, it's something that I've seen in my own life, this constant struggle with inarticulateness and with self-knowledge. And trying to play that out in a character was actually very emotionally revealing for me, mm-hmm. and really showed me so many of the ways in which Link and I are alike.
So I hear that you say a lot that some of your writing is therapeutic. So is that kind of how you attack your themes? You're like, okay, this is a theme that I see that I want to kind of play with. And then you start like that? Like, how do you go about doing that? Is it based on what you're personally going through or something like you personally observed?
I found that my best writing happens more often than not when I write into my fears. Mm. And so if there's a thing that I'm particularly scared of or worried about, if I write directly into that, if I attack that head on through a story or characters that go directly at that thing, whether it's, losing a family member, whether it's environmental collapse, whether it's, being separated from a loved one and all of a sudden them being made an enemy, mm-hmm. whether it's losing a parent, if I'm writing directly into that fear, it provokes some of the most honest and most, I think, emotionally daring writing that I'm capable of. And in some ways, it can be sort of akin to exposure therapy. If there's a thing that you're terrified of, constant exposure to that thing, presumably, or at least according to, received wisdom, can help you, desensitize yourself to the scariness of it and help you better cope with the appearance of the thing in your life. So in some ways, my writing is that. Now, of course, I don't know that there is any real substitute for talk therapy. Mm-hmm. If you can afford it, like if it is within your means, I can't say that I won't recommend it. But in terms of, the avenues available to oneself, I think one could do a lot worse for writing into one's fears. Yeah. I think that's been an incredible way for me to deal with things like environmental collapse, which is such an overwhelming and existential crisis and fear and cause for despair. Writing into that allowed me to see that even in the midst of all of that, we're still capable of joy and wonder at things. Mm-hmm. We're always going to marvel at a sunset. No matter how messed up the world is around us, like that capacity to marvel at a sunset is not going to go away. Mm-hmm. And that fills me with incredible solace.
So before we go, I want you to leave us with maybe 2 books that you think that everyone should read.
Oh, two books. Oh my goodness. Two books that I think everyone should read. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness gracious. Oh man. This question always takes me by surprise every single time. And now I'm cheating by
You're looking at your
peeking at
bookshelf. One of the books that I think everyone should read, one of my favorite books, is Homegoing by Yagasi. I love that book, and every time I read it, it feels like I'm seeing something else for the first time. So I always recommend. I've bought that book 10 times for people.
Okay, I have two recommendations. One of them is spec fic and the other is realist fiction. Although, it stretches the definition of realist fiction. The realist fiction recommendation is Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward.
Yes.
I feel like, any Jesmyn Ward book is a dope recommendation.
Yes.
And I believe that was her latest work of fiction. It came out a number of years back. It actually got her second National Book Award.
Yes.
It's so good.
I love that book.
It's so good. So good. And the spec fic recommendation is This Is How You Lose the Time Warp. And it's co-authored by Max Gladstone and Amal El-Mohtar. And it's maybe one of the most daring pieces of fiction and most dynamic pieces of fiction that I've ever read in my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm without words when it comes to trying to describe. I didn't know what it felt like to read a book that felt like it'd been written specifically for me until I had read This Is How You Lose the Time Warp. It was almost like on every single page, the authors were saying to me, we wrote this book specifically for you. And I've heard people talk about that feeling and mention that feeling and how certain books had given them that feeling, but I didn't realize I'd never experienced that, at least to this extent, until I'd read that book. If you want to see the possibilities in speculative fiction, both in terms of imagination, but also in prose, sort of stretched almost beyond their limit, read that book. And it's also not a big book. It's a novella. I love this book so much. So yes, I would recommend Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward and This Is How You Lose the Time War by Max Gladstone and Amal El-Mohtar.
Okay, that one I'm adding to my list. So thank you so much, Tochi, for getting lit with me today. Your book, Goliath, comes out January 25th, wherever books are sold. And I'm inviting you anytime you want to get lit with me to come back. I really enjoyed our conversation.
This was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye now. And that's it for our show today. Thank you so much for listening to the Getting Lit podcast. Thank you to our guest, Tochi. Thank you for coming on and having such a great discussion with me. I am your host, Lala, and you can find me on Instagram at This Black Girl Reads. Don't forget to jump over to Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to leave a rating and review to get the podcast in front of more eyes. It is so appreciated. And I would love to know what you guys are reading next. What's on your radar? What's on your TBR list? Let me know. Remember that all these books, the links are in the show notes, so you can find them there. And thank you so much for getting lit with me today. Remember that if you're reading what everyone else is reading, then you'll probably think the way everyone else is thinking.